Tying this a little bit to requirements, how could,
Yeah.
because we see definitely like requirements playing like a foundational role to tackle this type of challenges. So
Yes.
how would you say teams should pretty much see requirements to tackle these challenges?
Well, the requirements are absolutely critical. There was an interesting anecdote I heard from some colleagues in Australia that one of the major coal seam gas projects was working its way through its waterfall method and got to the point where they needed to take a major decision around proceeding or not proceeding. And at the very last moment, someone said, hey, where and how are we handling the wastewater from this facility? And there was no piping. There was no instrumentation. No one was thinking about it through the entire design stage. And this is so you can imagine this a very significant breakdown. This had to have been a critical requirement at the regulatory stage just to get permits to do anything at all. And yet here we are all the way down to the milestone stage, and this critical resource, water, somehow wasn't factored into the business planning and permitting. It's a millions of dollar miss. There was another example in Alberta about a oil facility oil sands plant forgot to provision their settling pond. Now, how do you forget a settling pond? Well, this is a breakdown in requirements. Like the requirements clearly did not work correctly. The whole process was somewhere was broken all the way through to the end, where you come out and go, "Oh, how did we forget the settling pond?" It's mind-boggling when you think about it. Get to that level. So requirements and requirements tracing is absolutely vital, and we still have lots of examples, even in 2020, where companies get out the other end of a major industrial exercise and discover they forgot something really big, let alone something small. It's one thing to come out and say, well, this tank should have had a stairwell put on it and how did we miss that? It's quite another when the entire tank is gone. Like that's a bigger miss, I think. But it, unfortunately, it's still too common in the industry.
And what you think are the reason why those teams basically had those kind of miss on those projects? What's the reason? What's the tips to try to avoid that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I had a nice single, do this one thing. it would be, things would be better. I think in this instance, there was a cascading series of challenges. But certainly one of them would have been the absence of appropriate information planning infrastructure in the project, where each of these requirements flagged, say, at one stage of the project, were traced all the way through, and you could see how they were respected and captured and dealt with all the way through to the end. So that infrastructure clearly broke down because it should have caught it. There was, in the case of these projects, there would have to have been an organizational problem. In other words, it's not logical you would come out the other end of a major oil facility that does involve water, only to discover you forgot water in the design. How is that possible? And that really highlights that there was an organizational breakdown. Somewhere in this, how they organized the project, they did not have clear enough accountability for a specific individual or team to be thinking about water all the way through the requirement set. So there's clearly, I think, an organizational issue. And third, other factors, when companies are dealing with, say, multiple contractors, stakeholders, and engineering firms on a major project, each of those firms will bring their own ways of doing work, their own systems, for instance. And sometimes those can be quite incompatible with each other, and things can just fall through the cracks. That's a common problem. And then finally, even where you say take a engineering document, that then has to be handed over to and broken out into its components so the different sub-teams can work on their respective elements and pieces of it. Even that infrastructure is quite fraught because the sheer number of requirements is overwhelming. The number of documents, the number of involved parties, the tight timelines. You add it all up, and you can see why this is such a challenging area to get right. But I, in my view, I see the world typically through a digital hat. I look at that underlying process, and it feels to me like there's a lack of investment in thinking about requirements as a critical piece of the industrial puzzle that companies have to solve.